On this computer. Thank you very much. We're 8 minutes into the conversation. It looks like we're recording now. Thank you, all of you who are so patient. One more time. It's like take three. My name is Irma Jennings. I'm a holistic bone coach. I have been working in the field of osteoporosis and osteopenia since my diagnosis in 2005, which started me on my journey of learning all about food for healthy bones. I decided not to take the Fosmex medicine. And again, I'm not against medicine. If you need medicine, we all have to take medicine. But I wanted to figure out my own journey. And what I found out is that food for me was working, but also with the multidisciplinary approach, which was not only food, but lifestyle adjustments, stress reduction, um, supplementation when needed, sleep hygiene, and getting my DEXA and trabecular bone score done every 2 years and having a clinical densitometrist who can read the reports and working with bone doctors. I work with clients privately and also in my Bones tribe. We have many members of the Bones tribe here today. So welcome to everyone. Yet there was something lingering in the background of my journey that I know I have inside of me, which are heavy metals and toxins. I'm carrying around a heavy lead and mercury that I will be working on chelating through out of my system, and it takes time and it takes money. But we have approximately 90,000 unregulated chemicals that are in our system and have not been adequately tested for their effects on human health. So I'm very grateful to have Dr. Aly Cohen presenting today on her body of work that has taken her at least 8 years to put together in a couple different forms. First of all, she wrote the textbook that is now being used, the textbook from Oxford Publishing. Am I getting that correct?
Yes.
So that's used within the integrative world. So it's all about the toxins in our world. And then the consumer book, which is this book that I've talked about, the non-toxin guide to living healthy in a chemical world. This is a must-own book to have in your reference library. It's not necessarily the book that you'll read like at nighttime, but I have been going through this and it's mind-boggling. Yoga mats. I mean, what she really breaks down, the two of them break down and talk about, is so very, very important. And I can't emphasize that enough, that we are in charge of our health. And this is one of the tools that we use. Before I go into Dr. Cohen, I want to point out a documentary which is called Dark Water. This you can read or listen to or view on Netflix. And it's a documentary about how DuPont destroyed the drinking water of 70,000 residents in Clarksburg, West Virginia, who are now coming up with various autoimmune issues and, in particular, cancer, thyroid cancer in particular. But because the waters were polluted with PFOAs, and once PFOAs are in the system, you can't get them out of the system, whether or not it's in the environment or in yourself. Is that correct, Dr. Cohen?
Yes, that's in fact correct. And we're finding that any component that has fluorine or fluoride in it can actually be quite harmful to the human body and last quite a long time.
It's painful. And then we have a more current episode going on in Flint, Michigan, where the residents cannot drink the water because the water has been contaminated. So we have to pay attention to these things. And I know in the state of COVID and all this negative news, it's like, don't tell me one more piece of news. But here's the thing. Dr. Cohen will give you easy workarounds. And just as I was mentioning about the PFOAs are in the Teflon coated pans that we want to get rid of, she suggests, and I suggest also, to use stainless steel or the cast iron pots and pans. So Dr. Cohen, would you introduce yourself and would you tell us what a triple board certified means?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Irma, and for inviting me to speak to your panel and your colleagues. This is wonderful. It's great to have a great audience. So I'm a triple board certified in that I'm board certified through Western medicine oversight and regulatory bodies for internal medicine, rheumatology as a subspecialty, and integrative medicine, which I actually studied and trained with Dr. Andrew Weil and his colleagues for 2 years, and then became board certified, which is now a actual board certification in this country, which is fabulous. Just a few years in the making. But I'm also an environmental health expert. I got into this field rather reluctantly, or I should say serendipitously. If you read the introduction in that book, as you mentioned, the book that just came out, Non-Toxic, the introduction is really quite readable and quite the story of how I got into this through my dog being ill and sort of how it led me into the world of environmental health. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm glad to try to make the connections, connect the dots between how our environment actually plays into bone strength and bone metabolism. Since I am a rheumatologist, this is what I do. I'm an integrative rheumatologist, so in terms of medications, I certainly try to avoid medications that are currently available, if in fact there is an appropriate reason to do so. Um, so that being said, fire away.
Well, why don't you tell us about give us the brief story about your dog, how you got into this whole conversation.
Sure. I mean, really, I think this is the why of why people should listen to the concept of how chemicals affect health. And there's a lot of different effects on human health that I would say are under environmental health, including stress, including poor sleep, including sedentary lifestyle, including noise pollution, synthetic light. So, really, anything EMF radiation, which we have a chapter in this book on how to use our tech toys safely. But the idea is anything that affects human health from the outside technically is environmental health. This book happens to spend a great deal of time on chemicals, which happens to be quite pervasive, and I think is of great urgency considering how much we are surrounded by so many unregulated, untested chemicals that we've created out of our love for stuff. And especially after World War II, when we were creating chemicals for plexiglass, for pilots to be able to have unshatterproof windows, pesticides to go across into foreign lands and not have malaria and a variety of other infectious diseases. Um, but then we went kind of off the rails and developed a bunch of chemicals for plastics and plastic containers to store food quite efficiently, which is great. But we went also into Tupperware and plastic containers for storage, and then those chemicals made their way into other things that we love, which is our cleaning products, our personal care products, our feminine care products, which a lot of people don't realize or are not aware of. The load of chemicals that we get intravaginally in our young women that start young and continue all the way through menopause. So there's a lot of exposures dermally through the air. Our home air quality can be often quite toxic, even more so than outside of our home, because of what we bring in terms of the chemicals we bring in and are marketed to. So, this 90,000 number is quite real, and it's been growing. I mean, I look back at my notes from a few years ago when it was 80,000. And what we're seeing is that the growth of chemicals without being tested is really a legislative failure, really, especially from the 1970s, 1976, when we had a law called Toxic Substance Control Act, that really started its footing, but never really fully made its way to requiring US manufacturers to test their chemicals before they go into all of the products that we are now using. And about 15, 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, we discovered, I say we, meaning third party researchers, not manufacturing companies, that, many of these chemicals out of the 90,000 can actually cause a great deal of harm with the human endocrine system. And in fact, the hormones that regulate some of the most important physiologic processes in our body. And they're known as endocrine disruptors or hormone disruptors, but more formally endocrine system disruptors or EDCs. Now we have over 1,000 that are known, but there are many more that haven't been tested because, of course, this is outside research. This is university, this is international information. The World Health Organization has written numerous, 4-inch thick papers on the robust nature of the scientific evidence for this. And certainly American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, the American Academy of Reproductive Medicine, obstetricians, gynecologists. So this is really well known now, and I'll try to relate some of the information specific to bone, but certainly towards the entire endocrine system, which we now know can be affected by many of these everyday chemicals.
So a question. Should we talk about the dog or how you
Oh,
got into this?
sorry. I got off my topic here. So the dog was really my baby, my firstborn golden retriever. Had him before my two children, and around 4.5 years of age, he got really sick. We didn't really know why. I had two young children at that time. And, we took him to the vet thinking golden retriever, he probably swallowed a sock. And what ended up happening is that when we brought him, they said, we can't believe he's so ill. And I said, well, what do you mean? And it turned out his liver was about the size of a golf ball. And we said, what are you talking about? And it turns out that he had what was called autoimmune hepatitis, which was an autoimmune disease that's so rare in humans, particularly, but also much more rare in animals, particularly dogs, and even most particularly in golden retrievers. And we worked with our vet to try to figure out where this might have, come from, where his immune system might have been triggered to work against his own body. And we really, we treated him like a human patient. We got him to last another 6 months, but during this time period, I was really quite heartbroken and quite upset that I started researching what might have caused his immune system to be triggered. Again, I'm an immune system doctor. I treat autoimmunity, so this is really a sad irony. And I looked at his dog food and tried to figure out if it was contaminated. I looked at his drinking water, whether or not it might have been contaminated. We live in a farm in New Jersey, and I really was concerned about the pesticide spraying, especially in our town, our backyard, really. I worried about the flea and tick collars and the, pesticides and, chemicals that we used to put as little dabs behind his neck and in his collars. And even the toy that he literally never dropped out of his mouth, which was a red plastic toy, and kept him from actually eating the siding of our house, which was wonderful. But we really he never dropped it out of his mouth, even while he slept. So, of course, it was in his mucous membranes of his mouth. So, while I was trying to figure out how he got sick, I started to understand and sort of pull the shades back on all of this unregulated manufacturing and chemical evaluation in this country, in the United States. And I was really more shocked than anything else that here I was, a practicing physician, a specialist, no less. And I'd never once heard, not once, that chemicals in our products could have any effect on human health. And it was just kind of mind blowing to the point where I would sit in my kitchen often and look around with no one around going, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? And I finally reached out to Environmental Working Group, which is a wonderful nonprofit in DC. And I asked to speak to their senior scientist to say, hey, listen, maybe doctors should hear about this. Do you want, I just want to know, can I send you my slides that I created for local community lectures? And maybe you can just tell me if I'm getting it correct, because I had never learned this stuff. And she called me back, a wonderful woman named Dr. Joanna Congleton, who said, I've never heard of a doctor show interest in this.
Mhm.
And we went ahead and created a CME program over the course of a year and a half. And mind you, it was a year and a half learning curve for me. She would send me really important articles that were in the medical literature and explain things to me and how these, chemicals, endocrine disruptors work. They have a very different toxicology than we're all used to. In fact, they work at very, very low levels, like parts per trillion, parts per billion, which is the way hormones work, in very, very minute amounts. And no one's ever bothered to look at the low levels. Everyone always believes the dose is the poison, where the more exposure you get to something, the more you're going to have that, reaction is going to be in proportion to the exposure. And in fact, that's not how endocrine disrupting chemicals work. And it really threw toxicology and biology and environmental sciences on its head, because now we know that there's stuff that's getting into our bodies, particularly wildlife as well, that are causing a whole variety of endocrine related problems, infertility issues, bone and growth metabolism issues, brain development in utero. Is very much dependent on hormones, thyroid hormone for growth and development, puberty in young kids, but also congenital issues in young male boys, of course, newborns. So we're seeing that these effects are happening on insulin, which is a hormone, in terms of glucose metabolism, fat cells, whether they are created from stem cells or they grow big or small, is dependent on endocrine hormones. And so once you start to see all of the connections with even endocrine sensitive cancers, you can see that this is really becoming a big problem, and no one really knew about it and hasn't made a lot of news until I would say the last 15 years or 10, 15 years. And so all I'm doing is really, trying to convey the information to the masses that will listen. Doctors were resistant. I will say that I probably lectured to over 23 or four grand rounds at very, very good institutions. And there was not a lot of interest even in changing out their plastic tubing for their NICUs and and their different ICUs environments, which was where a lot of these chemicals can be actually given to people in the hospital, let alone newborns. So I started to think about where else I could get this information, and high schoolers turned out to be the greatest place ever. And so now I teach high school, and I'm working to get this into high schools and colleges across the country.
That's a great step, because that's the next generation, and those are the fighters. So I don't know the knowledge base of our audience. Does anybody want more clarity about what the endocrine system is, or maybe you can say that in a sort of bite-sized consumer way?
Sure. Just to simplify it, so our hormones, which many people have heard of hormones, are part of this human endocrine system. And hormones are signalers. All they really are message signalers that really go around the body in very, very, very tiny, tiny amounts. Because through evolution, we've learned to conserve the making of anything we don't need to make as a creature evolves, so to speak. And these hormones that are signalers essentially go to different parts of the body, be it the brain, the kidney, different areas, muscle tissue, the pancreas, all these different areas where it has to say to produce more or less of one thing or another, or to tell bone to grow, or muscle to become stronger, or brains to develop. Those signalers or hormones can be disrupted by these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And what these chemicals have been shown to do, and of course, each one is different as they've been studied, but they essentially can either block the function of a hormone at the receptor, which is where it's caught at the end, of the signal, or it can decrease the amount of hormone that's created. And it can change the amount of how much is created, of course, but also how it functions, whether or not it's even functional as a hormone. So disruption is a very broad way of saying it messes with our hormones. And because of that, it changes our normal evolutionary or normal physiologic behaviors in terms of change. So that includes bone. It includes whether or not we age, so to speak, successfully, where our bones can maintain their strength. Of course, there's lots of other factors, and we can go into that as well in terms of bone loss or bone loss, increased fragility, and risk for fracture from the trabecular bone consistency. But in general, these are not helpful, these environmental chemicals, for a whole variety of reasons, but certainly also with bone metabolism.
We're going to take questions at the end. A couple questions are coming in, which is really good. So, what is the biggest um, offender of blocking the endocrine system or endocrine blockers? What is it? Is it plastic? What is it?
Yeah, I think it depends on the person and it depends on the exposure, right? Because, almost everything, and it also depends on our genetics, whether we get ill for any reason
Mm.
is a kind of a dance between our genetics, our lifestyle, and our environmental exposures. And so the prediction, and also the exposures, which type of exposures, for how long, at what vulnerable period of development, even. So there's just, it could be, during when hormones are really supposed to be, grown and developed and working, like puberty is certainly a very big time for hormonal change, as well as menopause, and as well as in utero exposure. So a lot of factors go into whether or not someone gets ill. But if you take the broad chemical exposure, view, you can see that when you kind of change your lifestyle, which modern day humans are doing, right? We're more sedentary. We take a lot of medications, which may, of course, be necessary depending, but medications have their side effects, and can lead to more bone loss. We have dietary and nutritional differences now in terms of whether we're busy, whether we have access to, clean whole foods, whether or not that food is even of good nutritional value, whether it's grown in appropriate soil, whether it's traveled for 6 months to a year or is frozen in a warehouse before it heads to, a supermarket. So there's just so many factors involved that what I like to do is just kind of take people off the ledge a little bit. And since it's such an overwhelming topic, and really just start to think about one thing at a time, just very, very simple. And in fact, that's how the book is laid out. It's laid out the way I wish I was taught this information as a newbie to the whole topic
Mhm.
with no medical background. How would I enter into this topic and be able to make real changes for myself in my body, and also for the changes for my kids who I'm responsible for, or my pets, given that I'm so connected to my animals. So, I just wanted people to know you dabble in, slowly. This is a journey. And I'm still on an 8-year journey, 9-year journey, and every day I'm learning. And listen, I don't change everything either. I mean, my hair is colored. I mean, in case you didn't figure that one out. Um, I happen to really like being a blonde. So I happen to make concessions in areas. I've worked very hard to try to lower exposures in every way else I can think of. But these are, personal choices. And this book is not meant to scream at anybody or to make judgment. It's to empower people to make changes that are reasonable, vetted information, and changes that you can make at your own speed. Okay. So that being said, I also start with some very basic recommendations, which is, pick the low hanging fruit. Don't buy a lot of chemical products if you don't need them. Don't bring them into your life, your home, put them on your skin. I mean, the idea is that I certainly have many ways to look up products, whether it's personal care products, great resources that are vetted, whether it's cleaning products, whether it's lawn care, if you want to avoid pesticides and move to, other alternatives that are very safe and effective. But I want people to start with the very cost effective way of just not bringing a lot of marketed nonsense into our lives. Window cleaners, door cleaners, light bulb cleaners. I mean, you name a cleaner, it's been developed. And, majority of those cleaners are not necessary. We can either make our own, which we actually have do-it-yourself cleaning product recipes. We have do-it-yourself personal care product recipes that are very basic and easy to put together, very cost effective. But for those of us who may be busy and don't want to get into the do-it-yourself world, the references to get choose products safely are certainly in there as well. I find it very intriguing. Once I started throwing out my entire drawer of plug-in air fresheners,
Mhm.
Bay Breeze, Ocean View, Berry Raspberry. I mean, names
Got
are
'em
just
all.
so enticing. Like you just feel like you want to be on a beach. Let's plug this sucker in. And in fact, the day I remembered, I wish I had documented the day I opened this drawer that I was so proud of with all these flavors to choose from and just dumped the whole thing. The house smelled entirely different within a few weeks because it does linger. And, we have to keep in mind that this is not an overnight success. We have to keep washing these things out of our lives, in our homes, and in our bodies. So you start with something very basic, such as, stop buying air fresheners or incense or synthetic candles, because, that alone will fill up your home, the air, it'll fill up your lungs, it gets into your body. And then, of course, after it circulates in the air, many cleaning products, air fresheners, and these types of chemicals will land on the ground and get into the dust, which has been studied, very well studied, dust in homes to be highly loaded with chemicals, flame retardants, phthalates, BPA, and there's wonderful papers showing this. So where do we what gets with dust? Of course, children on the ground, hand to mouth behavior, pets licking their paws. And there's actually some very interesting stories and well-known data on cats that have high levels of flame retardant chemicals in their bodies that have what's called cat wasting syndrome or hyperthyroid. So, and this made the cover of the New York Times because a couple really savvy veterinarians really put it together. But I want people to think about the stuff that doesn't cost anything. Avoidance or not buying it, cleaning more with just water wipes, nothing with chemicals that are sold as wipes with lots of fragrance and a whole bunch of harmful chemicals that are endocrine disruptors. You just simply need water, wipes, vinegar. White vinegar is a wonderful cleaner. Baking soda, sea salt to scrub with. There's just a whole host of safe things that we can buy and keep around the house without having to spend the money and expose ourselves to so many extra unnecessary chemicals.
So, what we do in our household, first of all, we don't use plastic. So, any containers, if we buy something in plastic, it immediately goes into a glass jar. So, we recycle all of our glass jars, we wash them out, and we use them over and over again. For any of our cleaning products, we use Thieves Household Cleaner. And that is an essential oil base. We mix it with water and we use it for everything. We use it to wipe down the windows. We use it to wipe down the doorknobs. We use it to counter. And I know we're not, I'm just sharing what we do in our household.
Sure,
And it's
sure.
very, very cost effective and also very effective. So, in the face of COVID, when everybody's wiping everything down, and anybody who has a sense of germ intolerance, the normal reaction is to go for the multi chemical item that's going to do the best job. And it's causing other difficulties. So, especially when you can't pronounce something on a label, that is a no no, whether or not it's in the food or a product. Um, so when we let's just talk about plastic because a lot of people I know are still drinking water out of plastic bottles. And what is your thought on that?
So plastic bottles, and goes to my conversation that I give a lecture nationally on drinking water because I was just so astounded that that came to the top of one of my biggest beefs is drinking water, how really unregulated our 160,000 water treatment plants are in this country, that they follow a law called the Safe Drinking Water Act from 1974 that only covers 91 chemicals in terms of what they look for, measure in terms of their maximum concentration level or MCL, and then also what they remediate in terms of what they fix in order to get those numbers down again. The problem with having just 91 chemicals in modern day is that we have over 90,000 chemicals that can get into our drinking water from into these 160,000 water treatment plants, which is our municipal tap. Well water has its own issues, but that serves a much smaller proportion of Americans in this country. And so a lot of people certainly are buying bottled water, plastic bottled water. And it almost seems like I was doing it for years because it seems like, okay, well, what are our other choices? Which we lay out very, very clearly and the story of water in the drinking water chapter. Because I wanted people to know the problem, but also know a whole host of solutions. And here are the issues with plastic water bottles. We often don't know, number one, where they've been sitting for weeks, months, or years. They can be in hot, hot environments. And we now know that heat actually, since plastics are typically not a very strong matrix or material, that those chemicals can leach out of the plastic material and get into the water long after it's been put into a refrigerator. And we've seen this, some of us have even tasted it when we actually get into a hot car and drink water and we can actually mistaste the chemicals. But assuming they're in there, whether you taste them or not, those chemicals can in fact act as low level estrogens. And in fact, there's been some really great studies. I put several of them in the book where they incubate, say, sea snails into plastic water bottles and they let them sit there for 56 days. And they look at the eggs that are developed, which is an estrogenic effect. And it turns out that they're much higher when those were incubated in plastic bottles versus glass. And they're just very interesting animal studies. We don't have as many, of course, in human studies other than big contamination stories like lead, because plastic bottles are very hard, in terms of sussing out any of these specific chemicals as causes. We use animal studies because they're much easier to control factors. But we put a couple of interesting ones in there. And in fact, plastic chemicals do in fact act like low level estrogens. And so, whether or not you're getting, you want to think about what to do about this. I recommend not buying plastic water bottles unless it's absolutely necessary. If it's, we're talking about a major flood or major
Mhm.
tornado or some type of catastrophic event, then of course, plastic water bottles are going to be necessary in the interim until you get your water system corrected or fixed in some way. However, If you have a choice to do this almost selectively with some thought, um, I recommend any type of filtration to start with, whether it's a carbon block filter, such as a pitcher, or it's from your refrigerator filter, or it's on your faucet. Those are called carbon blocks. They're reasonable in terms of what they can remove, but they're not the best that you can get in the consumer market. And so depending whether you're traveling from apartment to apartment, or what your cost issues may or may not be, that may be the most reasonable in terms of pricing. But what's interesting is that the most aggressive form of cleaning your water, called a reverse osmosis water filter, or RO filter, typically used, by the way, in dialysis machines. My dad and my brother are both renal doctors, and so we fight it out at dinner about why dialysis patients get this incredible great water, which is fabulous, but why is the rest of the population not being aware of what goes into our body as being super clean? um, RO filters now, if you get a vetted, maybe Consumer Reports rated, certainly certified, we teach people how to do that in the book. They're about $275. I actually have found the company, different companies are excellent. There's not just one, but we tend to buy everything that's manufactured like an RO filter in California, has some wonderful companies because they don't particularly outsource parts to Asia, where you can get really bad parts, even though it says made in America on the box of a big box store's RO filter. So you have to be very, very savvy when you buy it, but technically they run $250 to $300. I actually give them as wedding gifts, believe it or not. It takes about $150 to put it in with a plumber in 1 hour. If they take longer, then you've been taken. And it's about $40 a year to change out the individual cartridges. And the water just gets super, super clean through cartridges and then lends in a tank that comes with the machine. And you're drawing from the faucet that comes with it just water from that tank, because it takes an incredibly long time to fill that up because it's cleaning the water so aggressively.
But there are no minerals in reverse.
So my answer to this is that the value of removing the enormity of chemicals from your drinking water is far outweighs the minerals that may be lost, which you can get back with healthy eating.
Well, that's a
Um,
very interesting point because I never really considered that the pros and cons of that.
yeah.
This is the water that I drink and just wrote about. It's called Gerald Steiner, and it's full of wonderful, wonderful minerals, calcium and magnesium, and it has sodium, and it's just good for bones. But we filter our water at home with a Berkey filter. Now that you're talking about this, I'm thinking, and we have not only the carbon filter, but we also have a chlorinated filter. And I'm thinking, man, we should test our water again, because we do have well water, and it's important to test the water, which we do.
And newer chemicals are actually showing to be somewhat of a problem with some of these even RO filters. In other words, it has to be a filter that was designed to even handle PFAS chemicals.
Mhm.
And so, those are the ones that you alluded to earlier, but they are quite pervasive, particularly around military bases. They're getting into, tons of bodies of water. And so if they get into your municipal tap or your well water, even your RO filter that's used at the point of use in your kitchen may not be able to take them off. And so that is well worth the question to the person who makes your RO filter, is whether or not they are removed. And that was a question I asked my company. So, the idea is that you're absolutely right. There are nuances and pitfalls throughout this conversation, and hopefully we have given, the right direction and vetted resources to get to the answer that's comfortable for people.
So you're more comfortable with reverse osmosis. That's RO that Dr.
I actually think it's the most critical thing people can do, because if you think about the amount of water we take in per body mass index, even on a daily basis, we can't survive without water for more than 3 days as humans, where 80% of our body is water.
Mhm.
However, we can go 2 weeks without food. So the idea that even with small children, pregnant women, we're talking about a really critical component of what makes the human body function. And if we're not giving that a lot of thought, and of course, I didn't do this either, so I'm not trying to be judgy. I want to make it clear that, when I go to a restaurant pre-COVID days, and we went out to a lot of restaurants, you would sit there and you would serve you water and you would never even question,
Right.
where did it come from? And almost any single place you went in the world, even water fountains, you don't know if that water fountain is connected to a well. You don't know if it's connected to some municipal tap line. And so, not to go nuts, if you go on travel and you go out, you can enjoy water if you need to, but 90 or 80% of what you create could be made at home, where you understand fully that you're getting super clean water and transporting it in glass and stainless steel.
Okay,
And
so let me
yeah,
just say, so distilled water, Wally is asking, distilled water made in the house, is that as good as reverse osmosis?
so distilled water tends to be not antibacterial, antiviral. So it's distilled by heat.
Hmm.
But what's interesting is many chemicals can withstand heat. So I can't speculate on every single brand of distilled water, but I can tell you that distilled water by definition is mostly about raising the heat high enough to kill off bacteria, viruses, molds, yeast, but doesn't necessarily discuss compounds that may withstand great heat and still be in that water.
Okay, so let's go back to, we have the endocrine system and then we have the bones. So link those two things for us.
Yeah. So, what's interesting about the endocrine system and bones is, as we normally, first of all, let's go back to osteoporosis, which affects almost 200 million people worldwide. So, this by no means is a small thing. And it's actually a very big cause of morbidity and mortality of people falling and fracturing and ending up in hospitals and having very long stays in rehab. Men, particularly older men, do worse than females. And so, just as a doctor, I'm seeing quite a bit of this throughout my practice, and it's quite pervasive. As we age, people don't realize that aging in and of itself is kind of an inflammatory process. Unfortunately, I mean, it's well known that the immune system changes quite a bit just through natural aging, and that certainly lifestyle can make a difference in that. But what's interesting about the causes of osteoporosis, and again, there's multiple. There's autoimmune diseases are associated, such as rheumatoid, with a much bigger degree of osteoporosis or bone loss, just because of the way rheumatoid works. We know that nutrition plays a key role. So, for instance, young girls who are gymnasts that have what's called the female athlete triad, which is basically they're, not eating because they have to make weight. And they're losing body fat, and their body is shutting down, so they're becoming amenorrheic and not having their periods, so therefore their estrogen levels drop. They can have these young athletes bones of a 90-year-old. And so there's all these different types of compounding issues that can cause issues with bone loss. There's also vascular problems. If you have poor bone blood flow to the bones, you can certainly get changes in bone, certainly through bone marrow, which is highly laden with blood cells and blood flow and vascularity. There's also two different types of bone loss, which we have primary, which is like postmenopausal hormonal loss, or what we call senile osteoporosis. And then there's the secondary, which is often again caused by autoimmune diseases or some other type of illness.
Or
Um,
medication, or going back to the eating issue, so many people in my world have had long-term eating disorders that show up
yeah.
as osteoporosis.
Yes, and it's unfortunate because as much as I don't love to say this, that your bone growth up until 30 is a very critical time.
Mhm.
And maybe this is more about teaching young people about not to to let their nutrition go, because you build bone till about 30 on average, depending of course on ethnicity and genetics, and then you tend to start losing bone from say 30 onward. And so you really have to almost fight against this bone loss. And bone, essentially, if we go back to, how chemicals affect bone, is that bone loss or growth it's an ongoing, bone is a living tissue.
Right.
It builds up, it breaks down. It is constantly remodeling. Think of a sculpture that has clay. When we fracture, say you're a young person and you fracture, bone shoots right in to try to heal that fracture. And it's constantly trying to fix itself and heal itself.
It's a miracle.
Um,
It's a miracle. The body is a miracle.
it is quite interesting. I mean, you think about just even a fracture as kids, you fracture all the time as a kid, and then yet you're still up and running and doing your thing.
Mhm.
When you're later in life and you fracture, you don't have that bounce anymore. It's not quite the same because of all the supporting structures are not quite as strong as they are when you're a kid.
Mhm.
You're like rubber, so that's very interesting. Um, but anyway, in terms of this remodeling, so there are two types of cells that I'm generalizing. Again, I don't want to get too detailed with the immune system because I really don't want to scare people off with stuff. But there's two types of cells. There's the osteoclast bones cells that build bone. I'm sorry, and the breakdown bone. And sorry, I always think about the blasts as being the opposite. And the osteoblasts, the OBs, the osteoblasts that actually build bone. It's almost opposite to their name. Okay, so the class breakdown bone and the osteoblast build bone. And there's this constant sort of balance between the two. And what's been shown, and I'll attach this paper, or maybe you can attach the link to this paper because I think it's quite interesting. There's many of them, but this one happens to be quite interesting in terms of chemicals. Is that inflammation from many of these endocrine disrupting chemicals have this effect through the immune system, believe it or not just the endocrine system, but the immune system, to really change the balance between osteoclasts and osteoblasts, especially with aging, but now more so with environmental chemicals that are called endocrine disruptors. And so just the long and short of it is they interrupt the normal physiology of healthy bone development, healthy bone growth, but also the normal breakdown of bone properly to remodel as well.
So the inflammation, which is the outcome of what you had just mentioned, is a critical piece, not only in overall health, but absolutely in bone health.
Yes, because inflammation is now, obviously inflamed. I don't know if it's obvious, but we now know that inflammation leads to, of course, its association with increased comorbidities like diabetes, chronic kidney disease, chronic liver disease, lung disease, obesity, particularly autoimmune disease. And these happen to be the comorbidities that are linked to worse outcomes with COVID exposure. So when you look at, this baseline milieu of inflammation from just everyday chemical exposure, many of which are endocrine disruptors, and then you get hit with this sort of crazy virus, which tends to really cause a great deal of inflammation, you're seeing this kind of explosive picture. And if I had the slide to show you, it's a little complicated, but essentially that's what we've discovered, that that the people that have the comorbidities, which is also associated with high inflammation, IL-6, NK killer cells, TNF alpha, I mean, all of these kind of inflammatory compounds that are meant to be in our body, but not necessarily at this level. You can see that their outcomes are quite extraordinary for some of these comorbidities. So osteoporosis tends to occur more so in an environment of inflammation. And so that basically what it means is we have to do everything we can try to do to lower inflammation for not just bone health, but for all these other comorbidities that are associated with it as well.
So you're bringing this whole picture of inflammation and comorbidities into the world of toxins, right? If we start cleaning up our act, getting rid of the plastics, looking at what we're consuming, watch what we're putting on our skin, what we're putting in our makeup, our hair. Look at those products and look at the Environmental Working Group, which is an incredible organization to check products and things of that nature. That once we start, little by little, we start cleaning up our act, the bones and the body will say thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, there's really no downside to these recommendations. I mean, the interesting thing is I'm very, conscious of spending money. I have two kids. I am very conscious of the least effort possible because I'm so busy with work. And
Mm.
so a lot of how I framed even how this book rolled out was, what if someone was just like me and really doesn't stay home all day in an organic garden gardening, or just has plenty of whatever access to great foods or great services, clean drinking water. What about rural people who really need to think about their water that may not get checked for its contaminants but once every 3 months, which is how it works with fewer people in more rural areas in terms of populations and water oversight. People don't realize that. So the idea is that I wanted this book to have meaning, and to reach people that have maybe have the most need for the recommendations because they have poor food quality, maybe food deserts.
Yeah.
So that was something that I thought about, and I don't think there's any better time than now to really start making these changes because we're learning that living a healthy lifestyle is going to be helpful. The problem is that people have a very hard time with delayed gratification and understanding that what you put into it will actually pay you back with
Yeah.
less illness. That is the goal with this.
Playing the long game. It's so vitally important. Suddenly at 68, I'm thinking, the long game, how much longer is it? Well, in perpetuity, as far as I'm concerned. So I had a couple of questions come in. So Alicia says, what roles does the adrenal gland have in this endocrine system re-osteohealth? And how can you support the gland's healthy function if, let's say, you only have one?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So, in terms of, the adrenal gland is, really quite important because there's different components of the adrenal gland in terms of the outer, middle, and inside. And they all three sections of the adrenal gland, which sit above the kidneys, by the way, they help to manage, metabolism through blood pressure. They manage steroids that get circulated naturally through the body that we make ourselves, which contribute to a whole host of physiology. So the adrenal gland is really critical because it also connects with the brain and the pituitary gland to manage all of the thyroid hormone, growth hormone, fertility and female hormones or male hormones. And so there's this whole feedback loop in our endocrine system, which is really fascinating. And if we're getting too much of an estrogenic exposure, for instance, then our feedback systems get screwed up in terms of estrogen. So, not that I'm aware of any particular specific research on this, but of course I can look. But the idea that any of the individual hormones from or associated with the adrenal gland do not get disrupted, I'd be very, very surprised because many of these endocrine disruptors are not selective. Some of them are estrogenic, but again, we need to do research on all the other hormones besides estrogen, but that takes time and money and third party university level academic institutions internationally. I'm sure I could find one. I bet you I could find at least a couple studies because you could go onto pubmed.org, PUBMED.org, which is a national database in the US. Actually, it's an international database for medical journals. And if you typed into the sections, I teach this to high school students because I want them to be advocates for their own health. All you do is type in searches like osteoporosis and endocrine disrupting chemicals, which is what I just did a few hours ago. And I got, I think, maybe 800 papers. And you just start looking through them to see if they make sense enough to be able to understand them in sort of English, because a lot of them are heavy duty. But you can do the same thing with adrenal hormones, osteoporosis, endocrine disruptors, or you can do any type of search. And it's a wonderful way to really get even the headlines on it, because if you read the abstract of a medical journal, which is a lot of what I go through because there's just so many, it'll tell you what the article was about in terms of what their hypothesis was, how the methods and materials were done for that study, and then the conclusion. So the conclusion is often very helpful. Even if you're not, very well versed in reading medical journal articles. But essentially, what I'm saying is that when it comes to endocrine hormones, there is just a vast variety of how these endocrine disrupting chemicals can work. And there's no good to any of them, to be honest with you, because we still don't know yet how pervasive the problem is and how much that's going to lead to disease development.
So starting with a baby step,
Baby
steps.
steps.
And the
Yeah.
first baby step is buying this book, which you could buy on Amazon, Non-Toxic Guide to Living Healthy in a Chemical World. And I will put a link to this with the notes, with the replay. So I
Can I mention my co-author for a second?
please do, yes.
So my co-author is Dr. Frederick Saal. We wrote together. We co-edited the textbook for Oxford and had 26 contributing authors into that textbook, which was really remarkable. But I think people don't know Fred Saal, and I just want to briefly give him a little shout out because this is an emeritus professor, University of Missouri, but his work studying bisphenol A, which is the most well-studied of I should say, not most well-studied, but certainly prolific in terms of the international data on bisphenol A,
That's
BPA.
BPA,
Yeah,
BPA.
And
Mhm.
he is actually his research was remarkably responsible for getting BPA out of baby bottles, plastic baby bottles in the US and this country. It was mostly his data from his research at his lab, along with his collaborating colleagues. So I think it's just really important to know that there are these unsung heroes that you'll never see on the evening news and, partying it up till 2 a.m., although maybe he but does party it up. But, he's kind of like one of these guys or gals that really does incredible changes for human health and public health safety that may not get, as much media exposure as perhaps they deserve. So I just wanted to shout out about him because he's just an incredible writing partner and his integrity is impeccable. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned him.
So we start with buying the book, and then we go into getting plastics out of our life, and then we go into cleaning up the environment in our house. And then we consider the next step because there are many, many next steps. I'm thinking about getting a new rug for my bedroom. And I went to a green building company to see if I could buy a wool rug versus a synthetic rug that's coated with PFOAs, which is the flame retardant products that are on, it's everywhere. It's on the furniture, it's on our rugs. So slowly I'm going to be doing that level of cleaning up my life.
And
Um,
if you're interested, Irma, in that kind of topic in terms of home furnishings and that kind of thing. We give resources for incredible researchers. Arlene Blum out of UC Berkeley, she started a group and she'll give a list of couches without flame retardants because that was her work. She actually was responsible for taking flame retardant chemicals out of baby pajamas, kids' pajamas in the 70s. So her work is being, shared in this text as well because these are the people that did all this work and I'm just putting it together, but they actually have a wonderful ongoing living list. Again, these people are the ones who do the work, so that I want people to go to the resources where they're updated regularly and they're evergreen in order to find couches or rugs or chairs, which a chair took me, I would say, 7 months to find a chair without flame retardant chemicals
oh,
until I found this resource, and now it's in the book.
in the book. Okay, it's in the book. Edie is asking, how do we know if our body is suffering from inflammation? Are there specific blood tests and measurements?
Yeah, that's a great question. I saw a doctor recently telling everyone that the one test they need to get is the ESR or C-reactive protein, I think she was saying. But the problem is that a lot of these tests are really not definitive of inflammation. In my opinion, just given the amount of information I read daily and conferences that I participate in and just everything, the overwhelming amount of data, we are pretty much all inflamed. We're all inflamed to some degree until proven otherwise, unless you are living just the most pristine, perfect life without air pollution issues, without stress, without, with wonderful sleep, and you're jumping out of bed and running 5 miles, and you have super clean stuff. I mean, I just, it's a real challenge to live in a non-exposed life. And it's to say that you can measure chemicals. Certainly, I have tested myself through a company, and we have labs, by the way, in the book as well, that are reputable, where you don't, I don't know if you even need a doctor's prescription, but you can also ask your doctor to give it to you, of these companies, these labs that are very reputable for testing your chemical levels. And
Is,
I have done this several times. They're just not covered by insurance, so you have to
is
do
it
it out of pocket.
doctor's data? Is that
Yeah,
one of the?
doctor's data is in there. Great Plains Labs is in there. There's another couple of them. So I wanted people to have ways to actually test themselves if they choose to do that. But my feeling is, and from having tested myself, is that certainly behaviors change your blood and your urine quantities. For instance, BPA, bisphenol A, which we are exposed to through canned foods, all kinds of canned foods, sodas, everything. I mean, majority, a 99.9% of cans in this country, which carry food and drinks, actually have bisphenol A, a BPA lining, a plastic epoxy lining, and that's to keep the food away from the metal. But
Except
in fact,
except
yeah,
for Eden, Eden has a BPA free
they are
being.
the 0.001%. And in fact, it's interesting about Eden, they actually charge about 2 to 3 cents more per can because they make that effort. And so you're paying for it, but it is an effort that, people appreciate. So But I don't share brands, so that's why I didn't mention it. But you're absolutely right, Irma. But the idea is that what was I saying? Oh, so BPA can be measured in the blood, in the urine. That's how it's tested. They all get measured in different ways depending how they're broken down. BPA actually has a half life of 6 hours, which means that 50% of it will drop in 6 hours, and then 50% of that amount will drop in 6 hours, and then 50% of that. And so essentially, in about 1 or 2 days, you can literally remove BPA from whatever exposure. Typically, it's from food. Ingestion is the most common. What's interesting is that, I've tested myself before and after a lot of canned food exposure, and I've seen the difference in terms of my testing. Do I need that to keep moving forward with every chemical? No. I just know that the behavior and lifestyle that you take on can very likely make a difference in what's in your blood, your urine, your breast milk, and that, take my word for it, don't spend the money and make these changes, and you will save a lot, but you will still get somewhere. That's kind of the messaging, is don't spend the money testing if you don't have to.
And I want to address one thing: the out of pocket expense. I was actually going through my personal financial statements and looking at how much I spend on medicine, as far as testing,
Mhm.
out of pocket, whether or not it's chiropractor or my trainer, and I put
Mhm.
them all under the same category. And to me, that's my health insurance. I pay health insurance, but that's really what I want to focus on. So out of pocket testing, what's happening within the industry, and I've written about this in my blog post. I wanted to get a vitamin D test, and Quest was charging me $244, and I said, no, 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 that's ridiculous. I couldn't get a doctor to write a script that was appropriate because they needed to write insufficient vitamin D. I don't know. I don't know how to break this code down, but I do know that because the industry has, or the consumer has been screaming about this, that there are now labs that you can go online and get a test done through LabCorp or through Quest. So the vitamin D test is $34 instead of $244. So, being an advocate, or come and work with me, I'll share my information, or do the research yourself, but don't just shut down, because that's the problem. That's the problem. So I had one question from Janet, and I didn't want to get into my own personal story, but she says, since 2005, how much has Irma's DEXA scan improved? I was recently diagnosed with osteopenia 2018, and in lieu of a monthly shot, I requested to take Boniva. I'm 98 pounds, 5 foot tall, and 55 years old. We lose bone every year, between a half to 1% a year. My bone, what I wanted to make sure that I wasn't losing in excess of the normal loss. So I don't have my actual numbers that I could tell you right now, but I will tell you that I'm going for my next test next week, my 2-year test for my DEXA and trabecular bone score, and then I'll know and I'll publish that. But it has not progressed since 2005. I'm one of the people that are lucky. I don't, not everybody is the same way. So I don't want to say eat what I eat and you'll have exactly the same results, because I can't say that. But what I can say is know what you need to eat for your bones. And then Kristen was asking about what you thought about reclass. So this is a little off topic, but if you have an opinion on reclass.
Yeah, I mean, I have an opinion on all the drugs. They all have their benefits, they all have their risks. And we have a very limited amount. I mean, if you think about all the drugs that we have for blood pressure or for, antipsychotics, we have such a limited number of medications for osteopenia and osteoporosis. And I think that's really part of the problem, is that the choices are so limited when you go to a Western type doctor or healthcare provider. And so, not to defer away from the question, but if, of course, again, I have patients that need to be on rec class. They have done everything. They have done everything right, so to speak, in terms of their changes in their diet, or but they just have a lot of other things working against them, whether it's, access to clean food or what have you on a consistent basis, whether it's a genetic component. Many of these drugs, the bisphosphonates for sure, are supposed to really just stop bone from breaking down. It's supposed to block the osteoclasts, which are the cells that break down bone, because you're really never going to build bone after menopause. It's very hard to build bone and increase osteoblast activity unless you're given a type of drug that actually builds bone, like a Forteo type of picture. And so, what I like to do is use natural components that actually do the same thing as blocking bone loss. And, so I think if you haven't pursued that, and you haven't had a lot of instruction on those ways to do it, then certainly I would find a practitioner that can help manage that as well. But Reclass in and of itself is not a horrendous drug, so to speak.
Mhm.
Again, everything is in the context of that person's personal history, diet, nutrition, exercise, activity, walking, weight bearing exercises, fall risk. People don't realize that fall risk is one of the big issues because you could have two women. I say this to my patients all the time. I use the example of two women almost exactly the same in terms of being whatever Caucasian or ethnicity matters. Um, and they both have terrible numbers. And this one may be on the couch 8 hours a day and not really walking and is on blood pressure medicine that's too high. So she may be dizzy and she's not drinking a lot of water and she, has grandkids. So there's toys on the ground all the time. And then this one who has the same exact numbers on her DEXA as this one, is walking around, running. She's wearing low cut shoes. She doesn't, have toys that she's stepping over, that she's drinking water. She's not on blood pressure medicines that make her dizzy. Um, Same numbers, but different lifestyles. So that changes your risk of fracture, which is ultimately what we're trying to reduce.
And I will say one other thing about that. Even though the active person who's not on the couch may be multitasking, and the multitasking is a huge crime when it comes to bone health because that's when you could possibly trip or fall backwards. So we just have to watch that and be mindful. We have one, Carol is asking that she despises Amazon, and where else can she buy your book?
Great question. You're not the first person to say that. I found that really interesting. This is my first book launch of a consumer book, so this has been very eye opening. So if you go to thesmarthuman.com, which is actually my environmental health platform, I'm actually glad you asked that because I wanted to make sure I got that in. So thesmarthuman.com is the book landing page, and there are two other links there for independent booksellers. So we made sure to have not just Amazon as a link. Barnes and Noble is for some reason, I don't think selling the book for some reason, I don't even know, but the other two independent booksellers are, and they pull from all these small shops, which is wonderful. And so that's thesmarthuman.com. And then if you want to, if you don't mind, Irma, me saying, if you want to follow environmental health, nutrition information, on everything from breast cancer prevention to Alzheimer's prevention, mental health topics, just fun, interesting Friday mental health topics, sustainability. I post on The Smart Human on Facebook, The Smart Human on Instagram and Twitter. So it's always The Smart Human.
Okay, that's important. I love your articles that you post there. Thank you for doing that extra work for us. And okay, so Lynn Hughes was asking about the name of the search. So it's pubmed.org. Is that, yep,
Yes, pubmed.org. It's a little tricky, but you know who can help you, believe it or not, is your local librarian.
there you go,
So
Lynn.
if you have trouble, because for newcomers, I mean, it took me a little to understand it years ago, but because there's an advanced search, you want to hit advanced, and then it gives you a couple different spaces to load up with individual words. And then you push search and it kind of puts them all together to make sure that all those words are somehow related to the title. So it's a little tricky, but a lot of librarians are actually taught how to do PubMed searches. So I think it's definitely worth reaching out.
And then the last question, and thank you for going over. Really appreciate this. And this is a question that's come up. In fact, I was just talking to one company, and this is something that I often do. I'll research a product, Power Plate, that's all over Facebook. That's a vibrational table, vibrational machine where you sit on, or you do some work on, or you do plank on. And they're talking about how it builds bone density. And I called them and said, "Give me your studies. Show me the before and after DEXA reports." They're like, "Let me get back to you." So oftentimes I don't have that, but they'll make these very glitzy statements. And a number of companies are doing that, and one has to be very aware of that. But
Sure.
Alicia is asking, do you have any experience with vibrational tables that can stimulate sacral bone growth when impact exercise is contraindicated?
Oh, I have no experience with those tables. In fact, this is the first I've ever heard of it, actually. So,
Yeah.
I'm very leery of marketing, which is why I don't market anything. I don't sell anything. I haven't monetized anything because I want this into schools. And because of that, and it's probably because of my own paranoia over thinking that most of this is just junk. So it takes a lot for me to endorse anything, not so much here, but even with patients. But I look at life through an anthropologic perspective, and I try very hard to get people to live anthropologically like our ancestors. which is clean drinking water, clean air, social, good, healthy social communication, spiritual, sleep, clean food, whatever, so I don't believe necessarily in an outside contraption. I think that if there's a way to do it through physical therapy, even someone who's unable from an arthritic perspective to even go running or walking, there's a lot of really interesting, smart physical therapists that know how to work bone and muscles such a way that they can really help build bone through hands-on exercises, through isometric exercises. And I send patients with osteoporosis to PT all the time, as long as I know they're well trained to handle those kind of cases.
I'm very intrigued about vibration and bone health because I think that we are vibration, and sooner or later, something is going to come through around this. I don't know when or how, but
Well,
it's
it's a
very,
living tissue. I wouldn't put it past anything because it is a living tissue and
yes,
it needs energy. And we
right.
know that when people are sedentary, even a few days in a hospital, that they lose bone. And we know that people who go to the moon, all the astronauts actually come back with more bone loss.
Mhm.
So, gravity matters, movement matters. Again, it's to me anthropologic to be moving. And so, whichever way you can create forces on bone, that's how bone grows, is through forces. So that's a really interesting way to do it if you can do it,
Yeah.
but mostly I've done it through hands-on PT.
And your University of Penn, was doing a trial on a vibration plate. I tried to sign up, but they didn't. I think it was full. But anyway, so there are
Interesting.
studies out there.
I'll keep my ears open.
Okay. So, thank you so, so much for your time, for your knowledge, for your generosity, for your willingness to
Pleasure.
help us learn and grow. So, non toxic, I'm going to do it one more time. I'm going to
Thank
hold
you,
it up.
Irma.
Non toxic guide to living healthy in a chemical world, which is the world we're living in. Um, and I will have the link when I post the replay. Thank you all for coming and for staying and for putting up with the Zoom, whatever was going on there. And I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Irma, for allowing me to be part of this program and for putting it together so unbelievably efficiently and quickly. And you're so savvy. I love it. So,
Hmm.
thank you for being a partner in this whole fight. So I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you.